Good morning. If you're guests, we're delighted that you're here worshiping with us and recognize the risk that involves. And so welcome. There's people throughout the room that you'll see, not throughout the room like kind of spies, but you'll see people afterwards that with these Ask Me tags on. And so any questions you might have, they would be a great resource to you. Or you can find Chad, because as you can tell, Chad knows a little bit about everything around here. And if he doesn't know the answer, then he'll come up with one and make you think that it's the right answer and probably make people laugh at you in the process. So find Chad if you need to do that. We're a church that likes to gather and scatter, and make a point to point this out every week, just so that the culture and the DNA of this place kind of permeates everything. But our bent is that God is a transforming God, that God is a God who, through Jesus, has reached out to people to have relationship with them. And yet, one of the things that we're quite convicted and convinced about is that God's major means of transformation is not always the intellect, but that sometimes putting a serving towel over our arm and just mattering is a major means by which he transforms our own hearts. You could say it this way, that God is a God of generosity, and therefore it's through being generous that we oftentimes most easily identify with God. And so we talk about gathering, that's this, and coming together at 9 and 11 in a way that we hope is excellent and fun and offers levity to life, and at the same time, creates relationships and all those different things. And then, that the next 6 days we spend out there mattering, recognizing that our organic lives give us ample opportunity to do just that. And then at the same time, every once in a while, scattering together, hence the Grand Street, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the service. But that's kind of who we are. You've also caught us. We're the second week into a conversation that we started last week called the God Confusion, which is really a journey that we started in which we're really asking, can we find a faith that's real and makes sense? Which sounds kind of gimmicky, right? Like, yeah, of course you can. You're going to tell us what it is, right? Which isn't really what we mean. What we mean by that is there a faith that's honest, that's thoughtful, that deals with the times in which we live in an honest manner, that accounts for some of the confusing stuff and the beautiful stuff that happens in life, a faith that on one level is incredibly transforming and helpful and actually brings us into personal relationship with God, and at the same time doesn't make promises that it can't keep. A faith that speaks to life and that doesn't offer exempt cards with regard to ups and downs and crises and confusion and misery at different times. What we're trying to do is really ask what you could say is probably, maybe the most important question we could ask, which is there a God? And if there is, can we know him personally? And so, of course, part of our agenda is to help people who have never had faith, to find a faith that's real and honest and makes sense, to help others who maybe had a faith and lost it, to regain a faith. And for some of us, just trying to hold on to a faith that perhaps is slipping through our fingers. And really the motif of the whole deal is very much conversation. We talk a lot about the value of conversation, and my view of myself and the general teaching around here is that my job is to spark conversation. And one of the greatest compliments I get is when people go like, we've been talking about that all week long. That I try not to be the last word on things, but to create conversations that roll into your homes and dorm rooms and classrooms and apartments and neighborhoods, that you can think this stuff through with the people you're living life with and people that you trust in your own time. And I think that's especially true on this one, because we recognize that this is a big subject, one that nobody plops down in a chair and doesn't have formed opinions on. Like, no one here is going, I don't have an opinion on spirituality, give me one. Like, you have one. We all do, which means that really the best thing we can do is have honest conversation in a way that hopefully moves us in a positive direction. So last week, we also said, that the way this series is going to go is that we're going to ask questions that kind of follow a sensible order, because we think like questions are the key to a good journey, And so last week our question was, why is the search for faith so hard? In the words of Rob Bell, you maybe would say it this way, that what we wrestled with last week was that faith and doubt are dance partners in the spiritual journey. And I think what we try to do is open up the closet door to any teaching that would say that a faith that has doubt is actually not faith, that true faith is devoid of any doubt. And hopefully what we did was created permission to really wrestle and speak candidly about the stuff that, agitates you, the stuff that confuses you, the stuff that, makes you wonder. And really the challenge last week was for you to kind of get out there in your own life and spend some time of just kind of documenting, like, here are my doubts. If for no other reason than to emotionally give yourself permission and remind yourself that God gives you permission to have those. And if you did that, you're probably finding that some of them, for some of you, they might have been deeply intellectual. And perhaps for others, they were much more emotional, you know? For me, in the name of candor, what I realize is when I doubt God, when I call God into question, it's always related to his not doing things that I think he should, or not doing things that I thought he would. And so it's just helpful for me to know that I have an emotional response toward God when things don't go my way, which really has nothing to do with him so much as it does me and the innate need to be God. So I think there's a lot of life. If you haven't done that yet, I would encourage you to. This morning we're going to ask this question, which is really heavy, and I wish I wasn't teaching this morning, because it was really a hard week, because this is a big question. It's the question, does it really matter what I believe? Kind of a big deal, right? One that a line of thought that we're all familiar with. Maybe said more accurately, does it really matter what I believe so long as I believe it sincerely? Something that's real prevalent in probably most of our thinking and certainly in our culture's thinking. It doesn't really matter so long as I'm sincere in my faith. And I think part of my struggle personally with this, quite frankly, is I'm well aware of the fact that Christ followers in particular and people who are theists for sure have a tendency to become know-it-alls on this subject. Like, we can beat one another up intellectually here in such a way that we pigeonhole Jesus, which really isn't my intent this morning. And I think maybe just in the name of grace, it would make sense and be helpful to just remind ourselves why that thinking is so prevalent. We live in a culture, a society, that is, I'm going to argue, by design, pluralistic. The design of our country is that pluralism would reign. In other words, the design has been that people of differing worldviews and different beliefs that come at life from different paradigms could coexist in such a way that we move in the same direction together. We live in a society that said we're not going to allow government to prop up any one religion. We're going to allow everyone to kind of coexist and move forward. Which means, and now here's a heated word, that by default then, one of the highest character traits in our culture, or one of the character traits most regarded in our culture, is something that, for lack of a better term, is the word tolerance. Now again, probably we would need to spend some time stripping that from stuff that makes us uncomfortable or whatever. But if you just kind of remove your political tendencies and all those different things and just think of it, logically, it's required in our culture. Like, if we're going to coexist, and if we're not going to have a Christian government or a Muslim government or an atheistic government, if we're just going to coexist spiritually, then we've got to have this ability to, what one rabbi said, love our enemies. We've got to have the ability to walk with and live with and even like people with whom we disagree on life's most important questions, right? I guess I say all that to say that therefore, it probably shouldn't shock us that one of the beliefs that is most alluring to ourselves, and one of the beliefs, that our kids are going to come home from school with, and we come home with from universities, is this idea that it doesn't really matter what you believe so long as you believe it with sincerity. It flows naturally from the culture in which we live. But it also means that if we're searching for a faith that's good and makes sense, we really have two options. A is, they all do. If we're searching for a faith that's good, one alternative is in the name of diplomacy to just simply go, all of them, for fear of, betraying what is this other value we have, which is coexisting. And the other is that we speak candidly about that, and, that's not comfortable either. Hence, the reason I wish I wasn't teaching this morning. I do, but you know what I mean, right? It doesn't really matter what I believe so long as I believe it with sincerity. What I want to suggest to you is that when people say that, when you say that, when I say that, we don't really mean it. We couldn't possibly really mean it. Right? Because we couldn't possibly mean that some crazy cult leader who sincerely believes that he hears from God and therefore sincerely believes that God is calling him to lead a group of people, hundreds of people, into a mass suicide, and therefore sincerely believes that if he can lead them into that mass suicide, that they will get heaven sooner rather than later. We couldn't possibly believe that it doesn't really matter what he believes, that it's no consequence, that it's good by default because of the fact that he believes it sincerely. We couldn't possibly believe that the anti-Semite or the white supremacist is free to believe whatever they want to believe so long as they're sincere in their beliefs, because that's our litmus test is sincerity. We couldn't possibly believe that. We couldn't possibly believe that the clergyman, and unfortunately there's another story unfolding in the Southeast that kind of makes you sick to your stomach, who abuses his position in order to cajole young men into sexual favors, that there's no consequence to what he believes. We couldn't possibly believe that we don't care what he believes. We couldn't possibly believe, I feel like Martin Luther King, we couldn't possibly, anyway, we couldn't possibly believe, right, like the totalitarian dictator who sincerely believes that religion is an opiate of the masses and therefore goes to great lengths, even capital punishment lengths, to suppress any form of religion, is okay doing so as long as he believes it sincerely. We couldn't possibly believe, that the leader who believes in one particular religion and therefore persecutes anybody who disagrees with him is okay doing so long as he believes it sincerely. We couldn't possibly believe that the religious fundamentalist who uses any number of different tactics to threaten violence and to control the lives of millions through legislation and any number of other things is free to do so long as he sincerely believes what he's doing is okay. Or take the parents who think life is meaningless and therefore raise kids with a very nihilistic worldview, and therefore sincerely believe that it's within their kids' right to, at a young age, experiment with drugs and alcohol, and further to experiment with vandalance. That's a combination of violence and vandalism. It's a new word. Put a little TM by that, and we'll make some money off that every time it's used. Vandalance. It's like, it reminds me of Vandalay Industries. Vandalay Industries, Seinfeld fans in the house? It's Vandalay. Okay, sorry. We couldn't possibly believe. Davey, did you get that one? Vandalay Industries, yeah, buddy. I'll go home and YouTube Seinfeld. George with his pants down, falls down, picks up the phone, Vandalay Industries. Stop. We couldn't possibly believe that the parents who sincerely believe life is meaningless and therefore also absolve themselves of any responsibility to see to it that their kids get educated, and that absolve themselves of any responsibility to teach their kids any moral guidelines. Right? Like, we don't believe that. Which raises the difficult question, well then what do we mean? When we say it doesn't really matter what you believe so long as you're sincere, what do we mean then? And here's where I wish we were having coffee and it wasn't this venue, because I'm sure that you have answers that are far superior, or at least stuff I haven't thought about. Here's one idea, and it didn't originate with me, though I think it is helpful and it makes more sense to me more and more every day. What if resident in that statement isn't a desire to lead to a truthless culture like it implies? What if resident in that statement isn't a desire to lead to the type of destruction that played out to its logical end leads to? What if what it's really about is our desire as people, as humans, as image bearers of God, to differentiate good faith from bad faith? Like, what if it really speaks to our desire or our belief that good faith is right faith? Like, don't we all actually have this sense that there are some versions of faith, and even some variances of the same faith, that ring with an air of authenticity, of sincerity, of beauty and kindness, that actually make them good? And I'm not talking even necessarily a religion, but variety within a certain belief system. And aren't there also other versions of faith that immediately strike us from the person as entirely inauthentic, totally not sincere, and at their core, like ugly? What if, or then are we really saying, I don't really care what you believe so long as you believe it with sincerity? When we hear that statement, aren't we really saying, I don't really care what you believe so long as what you believe is good, so long as it makes you a better person, a better spouse, a better parent, a better employee, a better neighbor, a better student, better athlete, so long as it makes you a better person and doesn't hurt somebody else? Isn't that what really we're saying in our culture? I don't really care what you believe so long as it's good. Which really speaks to this idea that I think is prevalent, that good faith is right faith. And that right faith that's not good is actually bad. Follow that little piece of algebra? I don't know. That right faith that's bad isn't justified simply because it's conceptually correct. Therefore, when someone says, hey, it doesn't really matter what you believe, I don't think we're to take them literally. I think what they're saying is, as long as it's good. And I think more important for our purposes this morning, when someone says, I've given up on faith, I don't think we're to take them literally. I would suggest to you that what they're saying is, I've given up on bad faith. And probably what we're dealing with at that juncture is someone who has seen faith, many varieties, that is very bad. Someone who has never seen good faith. Someone that thinks their options are bad faith or no faith. And who here, if those were your options, wouldn't pick no faith? Many of your spiritual journeys over the last year or so has come with this realization of, wait a minute, good faith or bad faith and no faith? Is that all I have to deal with? Like, what if you don't have to pick between a version of faith that is driven by authoritarian leaders, ironically, right? Like, what if we don't have to pick between a version of faith that says you believe this because I say you believe this, whether you like it or not, whether that's a parent or a clergyman or some kind of spiritual guru? What if we don't have to pick between a faith that is entirely authoritarian and no faith? A faith that is driven by coercion and no faith. Heard a story recently of a guy who was at a dinner party, and it was engaged at this party with this gal who was not a Christ follower. He was. She was from the Far East, the Middle East, I believe, actually, and I don't even actually know what her religion was, but as they engaged in this conversation, it was a very candid conversation about spirituality and truth, and, a welcomed conversation. And eventually, she said to him, man, I'm really intrigued at what you're saying, but where I come from, I don't have any options. The cost of, getting rid of my faith and considering yours is too high. And she resolutely left the conversation right then and there. What if we don't have to pick between a version of faith that is coercive or no faith? Or a version of faith that is driven by self-interest, base options? I heard recently of some missionaries in Africa who were paying villagers to attend their tent meetings so that it looked like there was momentum. It's gross, isn't it? Did y'all get your checks when you walked in the door? Just kidding. Right? I've heard of a form of spirituality where the young women, the most beautiful, sexy young women, are sent out into the community to find men. What is that? It's a gross faith driven by selfishness. In church world, we say this to each other a lot, that you win people to what you win them with. Which means that if I get you in the door because I gave you an Xbox, you'll develop a faith that is all about, what do I get, what do I get, what do I get? A faith that I think most of us who follow Jesus would go, that's gross. What if we don't have to pick between a faith that is selfish and no faith? What if we don't have to pick between a faith that is arrogant? Like, I know what I know and I'm not going to talk about it. A faith that never listens, a faith that never acknowledges fault, a faith that always has to be, they always have to have the microphone. And no faith. What if we have to pick between a faith that is untrue? And this gets into the doubt stuff. But a faith that isn't open to being questioned requires us at time to simply say things that aren't true. We know they're not true, but it's the party line. And no faith. A faith that is entirely intellectual, apathetic, you might say. That's really about Sunday morning or Saturday night or whatever, an intellectual conversation, and now go live your lives however you want, because it's the guilt that's going to draw you back here on Sunday. I guess what I'm getting at is, in this conversation about good faith and bad faith, what if there's option C? A faith that is thoughtful and humble, inquisitive, and asks, this is implied inquisitive, asks a lot of questions. A faith that is always learning, always expanding, always learning new stuff, always ready to acknowledge, wait a minute, we got that wrong back then. What if there's a faith that is kind, that is good, and the pursuit of good and I don't mean being good so much as a good faith, leads to right? What if there's a version of faith, that is actually beautiful, that's driven by conversation? What if there's a version of faith that's relational, that it's not about robes and collars and high stuff? It's based upon the idea that there's a personal God who wants to know us personally. And that far from, wanting us to jump through certain hoops or do certain practices, he wants relationship with us. See, when people say, I've given up on faith, I don't think it's true, you guys. I think they've given up on bad faith. Now, here's the part where there's supposed to be a slide that says a Bible verse could go here. There's a funny story. We were working on, when I was on staff at Harvest, we were working on thank you cards at one time. And so we were looking at this prototype thank you card. And on the back of the thank you card, so it kind of looked like a Bible bookstore type of thank you card, And on the back of the thank you card, it said that, but it was in parentheses. And I thought it was awesome. We were sitting with the management team, we're looking over this thank you card, and I was like, that is brilliant. We should do that. And then I learned that they meant it literally. It wasn't an artistic design. It was like we should put a verse here, and everybody thought that I was a heretic because I thought it was funny that we should make fun of ourselves by saying a Bible verse should go here. Here's what this means. I don't have my Bible this week. Someone asked me this week, Adam, how long have you been preaching? Which I say never. And I said 5 years, and then later I was thinking about it. I was like, oh my word, 11 years. And my point isn't to brag so much to say that I've had the privilege of opening the Word once a week for 11 years. I've never done what we're doing this morning, and that is we're not opening the Bible. Everything in me right now wants to open my Bible and make an argument which I don't think is very difficult to make, that if you're looking for good faith, then Jesus is your guy. That if you're looking for a faith that is beautiful and kind and thoughtful and inquisitive, willing to acknowledge error, always growing, always shifting, always getting better, if you're looking for a faith that is good and good leads to right, then really Jesus is your guy. Now, I'm not saying Christianity is your guy or your thing. I'm not saying even Narrate is your thing. But if you're looking for a faith that is good, Jesus is your guy. And I would love to craft that argument, but this morning it just felt like we shouldn't do that. It felt like instead what we did, this is the Gospel of John. It's in a translation called The Voice, which is actually this really cool translation that they took scholars and authors and put them in the same room together. And so, it's a version that reads well. And anyway, here's what I wanted to do is for those of you that are like, yeah, a faith that is good. Yep, talk to me. Rather than filter Jesus through my words, rather than filter him through anybody else's words, rather than filter him through media or your parents or your, second grade Catholic school teacher, I just wanted to challenge you, if you're looking for a faith that is good, then at least consider Jesus. Because those of us who follow him, we go, yeah. His faith is good. He is that answer. So my challenge to you this week is, we got a stack of them over there. When we're done at the service, with the service in a little bit, I just invite you. We tried to grab something that wasn't super imposing and you wouldn't feel like some religious freak if you went to the coffee shop and read it or whatever, but just a way of engaging Christ. And, you and him considering whether or not the faith that he talks about is good. Dallas Willard, someone who I'm indebted to for a lot of this stuff, he says that one of the most important questions in our pursuit of God is simply this: do you want there to be a God? And he goes on to speak about this idea that God is not a party crasher. That just like none of us likes to be somewhere where we're not welcome, God doesn't either. And so, as convenient as it may sound for him, that in the pursuit of God, you've got to deal with the fact of whether or not you even want there to be one. But I've got to acknowledge to you that becomes a circular argument very quickly. And if you're someone that doesn't follow Jesus, then you can see right through that very quickly. Because essentially what we're saying is, to have good faith, to really consider God, you've got to believe in him or the idea of him, and yet, right, you can't, it's circular. You could say it this way: to have good faith, it's relational, but to have a relational faith, you've got to believe. See, there's some concepts that are very linear, A to B to C, and we can get into them in a logical way. There's others that are a lot more conceptual. They're paradigms. You have to step into them to really check them out. And I think the belief in God works this way, that at some point, and I'm not trying to cajole anybody into doing this morning, but at some point, essentially you have to take a step forward and go, are you there? God, are you there? Now, if he's not, you look dumb. But you'll never know unless you do that. My point is, same deal, that if you're at that place where you're like, God, are you there? My 2 cents to you is, well, at least give Jesus a hearing. And again, not filtered through religious people, not filtered through anybody. Grab a gospel and give him a hearing. Because his claims are that he is God, and that his system is based upon generosity, that the Father sent him to pay the penalty for sin, and thus we're saved through grace, saved into a good faith, into a faith that eventually becomes intuitive, and that we return the favor by being generous to others. So it's a little weird, but we're not going to make an argument. We're just going to invite you to engage John. Then there's this question. I hope if you're here regularly, and particularly if you follow Jesus, that you know that we take seriously our responsibility in bringing stuff that's transforming for you each and every week, and this weekend might be a letdown in that regard. I will say this, though. I think periodically it makes sense to simply examine your own heart and ask, not is my faith right, but is it good? Not if it's correct conceptually, not if it's superior intellectually, but is it good? Would my husband, would my wife, would my kids, would my boss, would my employees, would my neighbors say it's good? I don't mean that in any kind of shaming sense. I just think that maybe that's where we can run with this, is to take an inventory. I heard a parable this week about a guy who was arrested in a country in which it was illegal to be a Christ follower for being a Christ follower. And upon being thrown in jail, the state did any number of investigations and secured all kinds of artifacts from his office or from his home. And finally, when his trial came, the prosecuting attorney presented a whole bunch of data, arguing that this man was in fact a Christ follower. He had his Bible and showed how this Bible was littered with notes, that it was clearly weathered and worn, and there had been a lot of time spent in it. He presented a whole bookshelf full of books that the man had read. He even presented this stack of notes pages which demonstrated that he went to gatherings similar to this, bulletins that demonstrated he was involved with the local church. Showed a picture of the bumper of the guy's car, and there was a fish. Being facetious. Had him pull up his sleeve. There was a tattoo of a cross on his shoulder. That kind of stuff. Finally, prosecuting the state was done. The man rested. The judge, dismissed them so he could make his decision. Eventually, the man was approached in the hallway by a formally dressed man who he knew worked for the court and brought back into the court. And the judge looked the man squarely in the eye and said, "On all counts of being a Christ follower, you are innocent, sir." And the man was initially relieved and quickly thereafter furious. And upon securing the judge's permission to speak, began to say, what about the, the Bible, the books, the tattoo, the bumper. And the judge finally said, "Sir, your forms of Christianity are not a threat to this empire. We're looking for forms of Christianity that actually undermine what we're trying to do here, that are actually a threat to the priorities that we have. And so, sir, I don't really care what's going on between your ears. I don't really care what's going on in your skull. I'm telling you that from the state standpoint, you are not a Christ follower." Now, again, I don't say that to induce shame or create any kind of legalistic, works righteousness stuff. But I do think that on the one hand, as people are wrestling for a faith that's real and makes sense, people who've never had one or lost one or trying to hold on to one, those of you that feel secure in yours, maybe for you, it's just analyzing. The people who work for me, Would they say that my faith is good? Who cares if they say that it's right? Would they say that it's good? And just pray and think that through. Let me pray and begin to wrap up this morning. God, this question of, this question of it doesn't really matter what we believe. We recognize that there's a lot of danger in that question and that the conclusions are actually quite important. I suppose, Lord, what we're trying to lift higher than that question this morning is the reality that your faith is good. And Jesus, we collectively, those of us who follow you, just continue to echo that we know you're good. We know you call us and invite us to be indwelled by you so that we can live beautiful lives. At the same time, we throw ourselves at your mercy and recognize our need for your grace. God, for our friends who are honestly searching and wrestling and wondering, I pray that they would take the time to give you a hearing, to consider you unfiltered. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.